Right, so as the second phase of ceasefire talks have begun, according to the terms of the first phase of the ceasefire plan, discussions were due to begin on the 16th day of the ceasefire, which was the 3rd of February, but we've not heard a great deal of progress thus far about it. And of course one reason for that is that Benjamin Netanyahu cannot afford to agree to a second phase at all, for fear of his government being brought down around him. Where he managed to avoid losing his far-right coalition partner Bezalel Smotrich and his Religious Zionism Party previously, a large enough body on their own, as his party is, to bring down Netanyahu's government and dump him out of power, having bought off his support temporarily, the second phase was never going to be agreeable to Smotrich or his party. And now another has weighed in to remind Netanyahu that that second phase, much of the detail of which has still yet to be negotiated, but which does include full withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza, won't be accepted no matter what Netanyahu promises them this time. Short of something totally unexpected coming along, it's impossible to see the ceasefire lasting for very much longer. But what will Netanyahu's excuse be to get out of this? Because Hamas and Gaza haven't given him one. Right, so according to Hamas, at least, the ceasefire talks have begun as of Tuesday the 4th of February, a day late under the terms of the first stage of the ceasefire, the first phase, but they have started nonetheless. We are being told by them anyway. But talk is all well and good, isn't it? And as long as both sides are honestly engaging in it, and true to form, Benjamin Netanyahu's side are not, because he cannot afford to be. He's already been told by his hard-right coalition partner Bezalel Smotrich of the settler-supported Religious Zionism Party and Netanyahu's finance minister that he will collapse the government if phase 2 of the ceasefire agreement is agreed to, involving the withdrawal of Israeli troops and abandonment of Israeli positions such as the Philadelphia corridor, as that necessitates. Now, perhaps this is an issue Netanyahu might have hoped he'd seen off. He has got his bootlickers in the Palestinian Authority now in the Philadelphia corridor, working for him, and with PA leader Mahmoud Abbas apparently more than happy to go head-to-head with Hamas in Gaza in a bid to take over the running of the Strip themselves. So, strictly speaking, Israel could withdraw whilst maintaining control via them. The trouble is the PA are themselves still Palestinian, though, and that is crime enough in and of itself for Smotrich and co. They are not trusted by them. Leaving more Palestinians in charge is never going to be the answer for them in their minds, and the minds of their supporters, of course, which comprise the settler movement of the West Bank, who are very keen to move into Gaza themselves. It gives the Palestinians too much hope of a Palestinian state, as it were, no matter which Palestinians we happen to be talking about. Where Netanyahu saw off the threat of Smotrich collapsing his government to get phase 1 of the ceasefire agreement agreed, though, in order to keep Trump happy, as that was, a move which essentially has led to the increase in fighting in the West Bank as a result, appeasement as that is of Smotrich's settler base, as that has been to get that first phase through, Netanyahu having been forced into a position of having to agree to that ceasefire for Trump's sake, whilst trying not to see his government collapse at the same time. That's the juggling act he's had to be doing. But keeping that ceasefire going, though, he's under far less pressure, I would argue, to do that, because he can say he got the ceasefire passed, he agreed to it. If it collapses later, then he can find someone or something to blame for that. That is the Israeli way. It's always someone else's fault. To disagree, it just invites accusations of anti-Semitism, doesn't it? Therefore, it is probably of no surprise to an awful lot of people that Israel's Channel 13 has said the following on Netanyahu's position regarding the ceasefire going forwards, having said of Israel's delegation that the delegation heading to Qatar is not expected to discuss the second phase of negotiations. The Israeli delegation will discuss in Doha the implementation of the current phase of the Gaza agreement only. Netanyahu's sending of the delegation to Qatar is merely a formal step to please the Americans. So whilst Hamas and Qatari and Egyptian negotiators and whoever else are involved are preparing to discuss a second phase of the ceasefire as laid out in the first phase, it seems Israel has got other ideas. If they need the ceasefire to collapse now, after all, why bother engaging in any more ceasefire talks? And it isn't just coming from Smotrich now that demands that the ceasefire end before phase 2 is implemented have come in, as another government minister now has demanded likewise, as this excerpt from Jewish Press explains. Israeli Settlements and National Missions Minister Orit Strook warned Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Tuesday against agreeing to end the war against Hamas during negotiations on the second phase of the US-brokered ceasefire with the terrorist group. This is really the moment of truth for Prime Minister Netanyahu, said Strook, whose Religious Zionist Party agreed to stay in the government on the condition that Israel return to fighting in Gaza if Hamas's terror rule isn't overthrown during the initial 42-day stage of the agreement. If Netanyahu agrees to Hamas's demands to end the war prematurely, the Jewish state will become the punching bag of all its enemies in the Middle East, she charged in an interview with Israel's army radio station. If the Prime Minister decides to go in this disastrous direction, then the Religious Zionism Party will make sure that the government does not continue to exist, she said. I mean, you also have to remember that Phase 2 will still contain ongoing hostage exchanges. Israel don't have prisoners, they have hostages too, just like Hamas have got. They've still been taking more of them, incidentally, from the West Bank, whilst all of this has been ongoing, so they never end up releasing more Palestinians than they ever seem to be holding. Yeah, that bit never gets mentioned, does it? Phase 1 should see the release of all women, children and elderly hostages, leaving just the men left for Phase 2. So much for Israel caring about their hostages, because if they're male, it seems, stuff them, they can stay there. Orit Strook is another member of Smotrich's Religious Zionism Party, though. Who else would be put in charge of illegal settlements, after all? She is quite mad, though. In 2011, her son Zvi was convicted at the Israeli Supreme Court of having beaten a 15-year-old Palestinian boy, tying his hands up and driving around with him on top of an all-terrain vehicle whilst blindfolded back in 2007. Despite Zvi Strook only getting 18 months in prison when the maximum sentence was 20 years, his mother kicked off that the sentence was too harsh and tried to get it watered down, complaining that the only reason her son ended up being convicted was because the court believed the Arabs. Well, how dare they? Of course, if Donald Trump gets his way and relocates the entire population of Gaza somewhere else, Egypt and Jordan is what he's still saying, despite their protests and refusal to accept any such notion that would get Phase 2 passed from Israel's perspective, though Hamas clearly wouldn't agree to that. You can imagine the media would have no issue twisting the truth of that, though, can't you? But this is how fanciful our thinking has to get to see Phase 2 ever getting passed. Unless Israel get Gaza, or Trump takes over, as he's now declared intent to do, and which I'm going to cover separately, equally fanciful as that is, it will fail. Because Netanyahu needs it to fail, to stay in power, to continue to stave off those corruption charges that are pursuing him, and protect himself from that international arrest warrant too, of course. That will always come first. He will always put himself first. So exactly how Netanyahu torpedoes all of these talks remains to be seen, but deciding not to engage with them at all when they are already late starting and Hamas representatives are already waiting would be one way to do so, and certainly sends a message of intent to see the ceasefire fail. It's a bit on the chin, though, isn't it? It's a little bit difficult for him to weasel his way out of taking responsibility for. That this is going unreported, that the Trump bluster is dominating headlines as well. But it's easy to see how a cynic might consider all of this intentional, though, isn't it? Phase 2 is due to begin in early March. More likely, I fear, it will be a return to genocide, because Netanyahu will always put himself first. Still, at least the Palestinian Authority are volunteering to carry some of that genocidal burden in Gaza for them now. Helps with IDF staffing problems, so to speak, I dare say, but with blood already as bad as it gets between the PA and Hamas for completely justifiable reasons, it again doesn't help the peace process. Get all the details of what the PA are up to in Gaza in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch, as well as get a little bit of the background as to why the blood is so bad between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't already done so as to help support the channel, which is very much appreciated, and also ensures you don't miss out on all new daily content as it drops. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.